The Akkaya house in Beşiktaş stood out from the rest, exuding an air of elegance and meticulously maintained grounds. It was a symbol of the success that Halil Akkaya had worked tirelessly to achieve over the years. Tall gates, a wide driveway, and an expensive car, all of this signaled the wealth of its owners. Yet behind those gates lay not only money but also carefully concealed tensions. Halil was 42 years old, and his story was one of perseverance and hard work. Born in a small town in southeastern Turkey, he helped his father run a family-owned auto repair shop from a young age. Despite his modest beginnings, Halil always dreamed of something bigger. After serving in the military, he moved to Istanbul, where he started working as a mechanic. Gradually, he earned the trust of clients and eventually opened his own repair shop. His business thrived, expanding into a successful chain of auto repair centers. Halil became known as a self-made man, but with his success came new ambitions. Elif, his wife, was 7 years younger. As a child, she had dreams of becoming an actress, but reality had different plans for her. Growing up in a wealthy family, she was raised to maintain a perfect image and eventually moved to Istanbul to pursue a career in marketing. It was at a corporate event where she met Halil. She was drawn to his confidence and strength, while he was captivated by her poise. To those around them, they seemed like the perfect couple. He, a successful businessman, and she, his graceful and elegant wife. Elif quickly adapted to high society, but her heart remained distant, and their marriage was more of a formal arrangement. At first glance, their marriage appeared ideal. They attended social events together, generously donated to charitable causes, and maintained the image of a successful couple. But behind closed doors, Elif felt that their relationship was more of a partnership than a marriage. They spent their time in different parts of the house and rarely spoke. Unless necessary, Halil was consumed by his work, while Elle focused on maintaining their public image, managing the household, and handling external family affairs. A few months ago, Ath decided they needed a housekeeper. She justified it by saying she was too busy organizing charity events, but in reality she was simply tired of handling the mundane chores. Through acquaintances, she found Ice, a young woman from a rural area who had come to Istanbul in search of work. At 24, Ice seemed like the perfect candidate to Elif. Pleasant, modest, and hardworking, Ice quickly adapted to the rhythms of the Aya household. A was born in a small village in the eastern part of the country. She came to Istanbul with high hopes, determined to earn enough money to support her parents. Landing a job with Halil and Elif felt like a stroke of luck. Good pay and stability allowed her to plan for the future. Ace kept a low profile and didn't get involved in her employer's affairs. Her role was limited to cleaning, cooking, and keeping the house in order. She tried to avoid drawing attention to herself, but that wasn't always possible. Halil began to show interest in Ice from the very first day she started working. He didn't make overt comments or express any dissatisfaction, but the way he watched her and his presence around where she worked spoke volumes. Elif either didn't notice or pretended not to. Absorbed in her social commitments, Ice did her best to steer clear of any interaction with Halil, but the tension in the house was becoming more palpable. Soon, Ice started noticing that Halil seemed to be looking for excuses to talk to her. He would show up in the kitchen while she was cooking, asking odd questions about her life and future plans. She responded briefly and tried to finish her work quickly, but she could feel the pressure building. The attention from her employer was unsettling, yet she didn't know how to react, fearing she might lose her job. Elf remained unaware of everything happening in the house during her absence. To her, Halil was predictable and reliable. She trusted him because their marriage was always built on mutual agreements, where every word and action had its place. But within this stable world, an invisible crack was beginning to form. The household continued its usual routine. Elif was busy planning events, meeting with friends, and Halil was spending more time at work. Ice came and went according to her schedule, doing her duties as expected of a housekeeper. But there was a growing disruption in this routine. Halil was staying home more often on the days Elif was out for meetings. His attention became intrusive, his behavior persistent, but he carefully kept this from his wife. Neither Ace nor Halil anticipated that their comfortable lives were about to change. Ace kept fulfilling her responsibilities, trying to stay out of sight. Whenever Halil was around, she noticed that lately he was around far too often, as if deliberately finding reasons to engage with her or be in the same room. Her instincts told her it was best to keep her distance, but she couldn't afford to quit the job that had become her only stable source of income. She sent money back home to her family in the village and didn't want to worry them with her own troubles. Despite her employer's unsettling behavior, Ice kept coming to work, but it was becoming harder for her to hide her anxiety. One evening, while she was preparing dinner, Halil unexpectedly walked into the kitchen and stood uncomfortably close. She caught a whiff of his cologne, and a chill ran down her spine. He asked if she needed any help, but there was an edge to his voice that made the question sound more threatening than kind. Ace answered briefly and quickly slipped away to another room, doing her best to avoid eye contact. If didn't notice any of this. She was too caught up in her own affairs to pay attention to such small details. Ace didn't dare to share how she felt, sensing that her place in the house was becoming more and more uncomfortable. She thought about leaving, but she was afraid of losing her job and not being able to support her parents. The fear of Halil held her back, and every time he appeared out of nowhere, her hands would start to tremble. A few days went by, and the tension was reaching its peak. Ace became more cautious. She avoided long conversations with Halil, quickly left the room when he got too close, and made sure not to stay at the house longer than necessary. But one day when Ace was out for the entire day, Halil stayed home. He hadn't given any notice, and when Ace arrived in the morning, he was already waiting for her in the living room. She tried to keep her composure and went about her usual tasks, but his presence felt like a heavy, invisible weight on her shoulders. Halil began questioning her, asking increasingly personal questions. He wanted to know who she talked to, who her friends were, and where she went after work. Ace responded in short, vague answers, but his persistence scared her. At one point, he moved in too close and grabbed her hand, causing her to freeze. She managed to pull away, excusing herself by saying she had to get back to work, and hurried off to the kitchen, her heart pounding with fear. These encounters were happening more frequently, and Ace started seriously considering quitting, but she didn't know how to bring it up with AI. She was afraid that if she left, Halil might find a way to harm her. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, she called her mother and couldn't hold back her tears, but even then, she didn't dare to tell her what was really going on. The fear of the consequences was too overwhelming. The night when things finally reached a breaking point started off like any other. Elif was out at another meeting, and Halil stayed home. Ace was getting ready to finish her work and leave when Halil suddenly appeared at the kitchen doorway, blocking her exit. He spoke calmly, but his words had a menacing undertone. She felt cornered, and when he tried to step closer, she shouted something. Out of sheer panic, without even thinking it worked, Halil stepped back, but the look in his eyes made it clear that this wasn't over. The next day, Ice didn't show up for work. Ace was surprised, but thought maybe the young woman was sick and hadn't had a chance to inform her. Another day passed, and Ice was still absent. When Ace asked Halil if he had seen her, he seemed calm, almost indifferent. He briefly replied that Ace had probably found another job or returned home, but days continued to pass, and there was still no word from Ace. She wasn't answering calls or messages, and her phone was turned off. Elf began to worry, but her attempts to reach out through mutual contacts led nowhere. When she finally decided to call Ace's parents, they were frightened and just as confused. They too had lost contact with their daughter and couldn't understand where she could have gone. Ace's disappearance caught everyone off guard. She wasn't the type of person to vanish without a word, and this made Ellie even more anxious. A week went by, and still there was no sign of Ice. Elif reached out to a friend of Ace's, who occasionally helped around the house, hoping to get some information, but the friend also had no idea where Asa could be, saying they hadn't seen each other in a while. Ellie felt that something was off, but wasn't sure what to do next. The situation became more pressing when Ice's parents called her, pleading to find out if there had been any issues at work that might have caused their daughter to disappear. Elif found herself in an uncomfortable position, promising them that she would let them know immediately if she learned anything. Meanwhile, Elif's suspicions about Halil started to grow. She couldn't help but notice how he had reacted to Ace's disappearance too calmly, without a hint of concern. Elif began to recall how he had started staying home more often and showing an unusual interest in Ace, though at the time she hadn't paid it much attention. Now her mind was filled with unsettling thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, but having suspicions was one thing, finding actual proof was another. All she could do was wait while Isle struggled to figure out how to get in touch with Ace. The young woman's parents decided to contact the authorities, and the initial stage investigators interviewed acquaintances and relatives, but it didn't lead to any breakthroughs. They reached out to Elif, who told them everything she knew, how Ace had been a reliable worker. There were no issues, but she hadn't shown up for several days, and no one had been able to locate her. The police began their investigation, but without any signs of aggression or indications that Ace had been taken against her. While the case was moving slowly, things took a turn when a neighbor mentioned seeing Halil's car parked near the house late at night before Ice disappeared, even though he usually didn't come home that late. This statement was the first small clue, but it didn't yet paint a clear picture. Elif felt increasingly confused and wasn't sure if she should trust her own suspicions. One evening, while Elif was sitting in the living room nervously fiddling with her phone, Halil approached her and suggested they talk. He brought up the rumors surrounding EY's disappearance, saying that they could damage their reputation, especially his business, and that she needed to stop worrying about it. Elif wanted to ask him directly what he knew about it, but she couldn't find the courage. Halil had a way of pressuring people, and his calm, confident manner often stifled any resistance. She felt a growing fear that if she started asking too many questions, it could lead to unwanted consequences. She nodded and said she would try not to think about it, but inside her, Anxiety continued to build. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detectives started reviewing surveillance footage from around the Akkaya home and along the route. Ace usually took. One of the cameras captured her on the day she was last seen. Leaving work, she was walking along the sidewalk as she always did, but what happened after that was still a mystery. Cameras at Halil and Elif's house also recorded her leaving that evening, but there were no other suspicious details. Elif began questioning herself. Why was Halil so calm about her disappearance? What was he hiding? And had he tried to cover his tracks as all this was unfolding? Elif tried to distract herself with her usual activities, but the thoughts of the missing young woman haunted her. One day after returning home from a meeting, she noticed something odd in the garage. Normally everything was neat and tidy, but this time things had been moved around, as if someone had been searching for or trying to hide something. She felt an urge to take a closer look, but Halil appeared so suddenly that she jumped. He asked what she was doing there, and his expression seemed harsher than usual. Elle mumbled that she just wanted to check if everything was in order, but Halil didn't break eye contact. Then in a calm tone he told her it was best not to get involved in his affairs, and that there was nothing of interest in the garage. It was a small moment, but it made Elle think she knew that everything in their home was supposed to be under Halil's control. But why did he seem so tense when he saw her in the garage? Something didn't sit right with her. But without any proof, she couldn't accuse him of anything. Over the next few days, she paid even closer attention to his behavior, trying to catch the slightest hint of dishonesty. But Halil remained calm and confident as usual. Ice's disappearance became a topic in the local news, and reporters began digging for information. They discovered that Ice couldn't have just left without saying goodbye to her family or taking her belongings from the apartment she rented. The police continued their questioning, focusing more and more on those who had been the last to see her. They returned to Elif and Halil this time with more specific questions. Elif answered honestly, but when it was Halil's turn, he once again maintained his calm, composed demeanor. However, beneath his calm exterior there were signs of growing tension. He realized that the police were digging deeper than he had anticipated, and it was starting to unsettle him. One day Ellie overheard him on the phone, catching a few phrases that sounded strange, but she couldn't make sense of them. He told someone that everything would be taken care of, and that there was no need to worry. Elif tried not to read too much into it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping past her. When the police arrived with a search warrant, Elf realized their lives would never be the same. She stood at the doorway watching as investigators checked every corner, trying to find anything that might hint at the reason behind ACZ's appearance. Then they approached the garage, pausing for a moment. Halil, who was standing nearby, suddenly tensed up, and If noticed it right away. When they opened the garage door, no one expected to see anything out of the ordinary. It was just a place for the car and a few tools. But when one of the investigators noticed a large wooden crate in the corner and asked to have it opened, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. AA froze, her heart pounding so loudly that it felt like everyone around could hear it. Halil took a step forward, but before he could say anything, the investigator signaled to open the crate. As the investigator opened the wooden crate, everyone stood still, bracing for what might be inside. Halil clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure, but his face had gone slightly pale. Eli, unable to contain her curiosity and fear, stepped closer, trying to see what was inside. The process of opening the crate took only a few seconds, but it felt like time had come to a halt. When the lid of the crate was opened, all it contained were some old tools covered in a layer of dust. There was a mix of disappointment and relief in the air. The investigators moved on to other parts of the garage, and Halil acted as if he found the whole thing amusing. But if noticed how tightly his fingers gripped the phone in his pocket. Her suspicions grew stronger with every passing moment. The search lasted for several hours, but nothing was found that could explain Ace's disappearance. The officers left one by one, and Thea felt a strange sense of relief, as if something important had just been averted, yet not entirely resolved. Halil seemed to regain his confidence and suggested to his wife that they should forget about it, dismissing the whole thing as a misunderstanding. But Elif couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something hidden in that house, something she didn't know about. After the search, Halil began to act differently. He became more secretive, often leaving without explaining where he was going and returning late at night. This wasn't like him, and Elif started to fear for her own safety. She knew her husband was someone who liked to control everything around him, and if he was hiding something, he would do whatever it took to make sure the truth didn't come out. Meanwhile, the investigation into Ace's disappearance continued. The police explored every possible angle, from abduction to a voluntary disappearance. They interviewed neighbors, Halil's colleagues, Elif's friends, but nothing concrete surfaced. Still, the investigators had a feeling that this case was more complicated than it seemed. The disappearance of a young woman who had suddenly gone off the grid remained their primary focus, and their suspicions were only growing. One day after returning home from a business lunch, Elif found that Halil was gone. and his phone was lying on the kitchen counter, which was unusual for him. She was about to head upstairs when she noticed the garage keys left next to the phone. Her heart began to race again, but this time she couldn't resist the urge to check the garage once more. She quietly stepped outside. Trying not to make any noise, the garage looked just as it had before, neat, well-maintained, with a few tools and old items stacked in the corner. But this time something caught her eye that she hadn't noticed earlier: a small stain on the floor, which looked like traces of paint or dirt. She didn't think much of it at first until she realized the stains led toward the back wall of the garage. How had the investigators missed these odd marks during their search? Elle moved closer, her breathing quickening. Behind the wall was another section cluttered with junk which she hadn't known existed. It was a small room locked with a padlock that looked new. She recalled fragments of conversations she had overheard when Halil thought she wasn't around, and everything began to fall into place. She knew she couldn't leave without finding out what was behind that door. Using the keys she had found, Aaa managed to unlock the padlock and carefully pushed the door open. She only cracked it open a bit, but what she saw inside was enough to send a chill through her entire body. The room was small and narrow, lit only by a faint light coming through a crack in the ceiling. On the floor were plastic bags, and the walls were covered with old newspapers, giving the place a dark, eerie feel. It was silent and cold inside, as if the space had been long forgotten. Her eyes landed on one of the bags, and I felt her breath catch in her throat. She stepped back, almost stumbling, and hurried out of the garage, closing the door behind her. She didn't know what to do next, but she understood she had to act quickly. She needed to reach out to someone she could trust and explain the situation, but every time she tried to dial a number, her fingers trembled and her mind raced with the thought that Halil could come back at any moment. Meanwhile, Halil returned home later than usual, and Elle pretended that nothing had happened. But the next day she went straight to the police and reported what she had seen. It was her only chance to get to the bottom of things and protect herself. Investigators immediately responded to her statement and returned with a search warrant, this time granting them permission to thoroughly inspect all areas, including the hidden room in the garage. When they opened the door, everything that had been concealed was laid bare. Inside, they found plastic bags containing Ace's belongings, including her personal documents and phone, but the most alarming discovery was the traces of blood among her things, which suggested she had been there and that something terrible had occurred. The room, which Halil had clearly tried to keep hidden, became the key to solving the mystery, and the police began piecing everything together. Halil didn't come home that evening. He had disappeared as soon as he learned that Elif had shared her findings with the authorities. Knowing he had nothing left to lose, he attempted to flee, but the police had already set up surveillance at all possible exits from the city. When his car was found on a side street on the outskirts, he did not resist and quietly surrendered to the law. Once Halil was in custody, investigators began a thorough examination of his connection to Ice's disappearance. Interrogations went on for hours, and at first Halil remained calm and composed, but slowly signs of fatigue and frustration began to show. The investigators deliberately pressured him, asking why he had been acting so strangely in recent weeks, what had really happened between him and Ice, and what was hidden in that small room in the garage. Halil continued to deny any involvement in her disappearance, insisting that he had no idea where she was and that he would never harm her. But the investigators were persistent. They laid out everything they had found in the garage: Ace's belongings, her documents, her phone, and the traces of blood on the floor and walls, which had been washed but still contained small incriminating spots. It all pointed to one thing: that something terrible had happened in the garage, and Halil had tried to cover it up. After several hours of questioning, Halil finally broke down. He realized that denying the obvious was futile. He sighed heavily, looking more exhausted than he had in a long time. Speaking quietly, he confessed that on the night before Ace disappeared, they had been alone in the house. Elif was out at a meeting, and he had taken the opportunity to try once more to get closer to Ace. She rejected him, saying she would not tolerate his advances, and warning that if he didn't stop, she would tell his wife and the police. His expression darkened as he recounted how, in a fit of rage, he grabbed Ace, trying to make her be quiet. She managed to break free and quickly began gathering her things, leaving the house and heading toward her own place. The words came out slowly, as if he was reliving each moment with disgust. When investigators began closely reviewing footage from the security cameras that showed Ace leaving the Aya home for the last time, they initially assumed she had indeed left and was heading home. However, after further investigation and analysis of other camera recordings, the police discovered that Halil had used a clever trick to hide the truth. That evening, Asa did leave the house, but she was walking into a trap. The cameras captured her walking down the street, but then she disappeared from view. At this point, the investigators noticed that just a few minutes after she had left, Halil drove out of the house in his car. At first, this seemed like a mere coincidence, but then They noticed something strange. His car stopped in a dark, secluded corner of the neighborhood outside the range of most cameras. It was there that Halil waited for Ice. He had arranged beforehand to give her a ride home, convincing her that he wanted to apologize for his behavior and have a talk. Ice didn't expect anything bad to happen and got into the car thinking a short ride wouldn't cause her any harm, but Halil deviated from the usual route and took her back to the house through a rear entrance, which was not covered by security cameras. This entrance was rarely used and hidden from the neighbor's view. Once they were inside through the back door, Halil committed his crime. First, he assaulted Ace, then he struck her head against the wall with such force that she passed away instantly. He knew that the cameras at the front entrance had recorded her leaving, which he hoped would serve as an alibi if anyone started asking questions. He planned for the police and others to believe that Ice had left the house and disappeared somewhere on her way home, and his car movements could be explained as unrelated errands. After Halil ended Ice's life, he placed her body in a plastic bag and carefully moved it to the garage where he had already prepared a hidden spot. He intended to hide the body and come up with a story to cover his actions. However, late that night, he took the body out of the garage and transported it to an abandoned warehouse, hiding it in an old container, hoping that this location would remain unnoticed. During the interrogation, Halil refused to admit the truth for a long time, but under pressure from investigators, he finally confessed how meticulously he had planned everything to mislead the police and cover his tracks. He believed his plan would work and that no one would connect Ace's disappearance to him. But he underestimated how thoroughly the police would analyze his driving routes and match them to the timeline of her disappearance. Ice's body was found in a terrible state. It was clear that Halil had tried to erase all evidence, but the clues gathered from the scene in the garage confirmed his guilt. The medical examiners carefully inspected Ace's body, uncovering multiple injuries, with a severe blow to the back of the head identified as the fatal one. However, the bruises and abrasions all over her body indicated that it wasn't just a single strike, but a prolonged assault. Further examination revealed other troubling signs. DNA analysis showed traces of Halil on Ace's body, serving as indirect evidence that she had been subjected to aggression before her death. The test results left no doubt the biological samples found belonged to him. Interrogations dragged on for several days. Halil repeatedly insisted that he hadn't wanted things to get out of hand and that everything he did was an attempt to protect his reputation. He tried to convince the investigators that he acted in a moment of extreme emotion, but they could see that his actions after incident were calculated and deliberate. He meticulously planned how to hide the body, cleaned up evidence, and tried to cover his tracks. This wasn't a desperate act. It was a carefully orchestrated crime aimed at avoiding exposure. In court, Halil appeared calm and composed, but every gesture and word came across as the defense of a man who had nothing left to lose. He tried to elicit sympathy, claiming that the situation spiraled out of control and that he acted out of fear, but no one believed him. His attempts to paint himself as a victim of his own emotions were shattered by the relentless facts that were revealed one by one. The prosecutor laid out all the evidence against him: surveillance footage, witness statements from neighbors, blood traces, and Ace's belongings that he hadn't managed to destroy. Elif was present in court, but her face was unreadable. She stood among the crowd listening to the testimonies. Realizing her life had collapsed, she tried to justify herself by thinking she couldn't have known her husband was capable of this, but deep down she felt guilty for missing the warning signs, for allowing Halil to act freely while she was occupied with her social life. She knew that after all of this she would have to learn how to live again, but she also understood that the life she had built with Halil was gone forever. The court sentenced Halil to life in prison. All his attempts to seek a lighter sentence were unsuccessful. His confession, along with the gathered evidence, left no room for AC quit. He sat in the defendant's cage, listening to the verdict with a stoic expression, but as he was led out of the courtroom, his face showed nothing but despair. He understood that he had lost everything forever: his freedom, his business, his reputation, and the life he had spent years building. As his story was not forgotten, and her name remained in the memory of everyone who followed the case. She became a victim not only of Halil's reckless desire and rage, but also of how easily she could have been forgotten until she disappeared. For her family, it was a shock that would never fade. They had found justice, but the loss would stay with them forever. Elif, trying to find a new purpose, left Istanbul. She moved to another city and began working with organizations that focused on protecting women's rights. Yet despite her external efforts to change her life, her internal wounds still bled. She knew she would never escape the questions of whether she could have prevented all of this if she had. Noticed earlier, the house in Beşiktaş stood empty and was eventually sold. Its walls, which once masked the illusion of a happy and successful life, now stood vacant, like a ghost of the past, reminding everyone that nothing is ever quite as it seems.